No mai, haere mai. Welcome to the University of Otago Theology Program's Thomas Burns Memorial Lectures. My name's Lynn Taylor and I'm the Jack Somerville Senior Lecturer in Pastoral Theology here at the University, and it's my great privilege to welcome you all here, whether you are here in the room with us or online on the live stream. Haere mai, welcome. As we gather ourselves, let's pray. He onere, he kororia ki te atua. He mongarongo ki te whenua, he whakaro pai ki ngā tangata katoa. Hanga e te atua he ngā kohau. Ki roto, ki tēnā a mātou. Whakatongia tō wairua tapu. He awhina he tohu i te mātou. He ako hoki ina mahi mō tēnei rā. Āmine. Honour and glory to God, peace on earth, goodwill to all people. Lord, develop a new heart inside all of us. Instill in us your sacred spirit. Help us, guide us in all the things we need to learn today. Amen. As I said, I'm lecturer in pastoral theology, and it was my great privilege and my most excellent idea to suggest that we invite Canon Dr Cathy Ross to present this year's Burns Lectures. And we're particularly grateful to the Synod and Presbytery of Otago Southland, who enable us to regularly host these lectures, featuring international scholars from the theological subdisciplines who come to challenge and to inspire us. So Canon Dr Cathy Ross comes from Aotearoa, New Zealand, where she most recently lectured at Laidlaw College, then Bible College of New Zealand. She's also previously worked in Rwanda, Congo and Uganda with NZCMS, and she moved to the UK in 2005. She's based in Oxford, where she's head of pioneer leadership training for the Church Missionary Society and lecturer in mission at Regent's Park College. And from 2008 to 2016, she was the General Secretary of the International Association of Mission Studies. So she knows some stuff about mission. Her recent publications focus on mission, and they include Mission on the Road to Emmaus, which she wrote with Steve Bevins, Pioneering Spirituality, co-authored with Johnny Baker, Missional Conversations, co-authored with Colin Smith, Bearing Witness in Hope, Christian Engagement in Challenging Times, written with Humphrey Southern, Imagining Mission with John Taylor, which was written with Johnny Baker. And all those withs tell us a little bit about Cathy's heart and her approach. She's a collaborator. She's a team player who likes to work with others. Cathy's research interests are in the areas of contextual theologies, world Christianity, feminist theologies, and hospitality. She's married to Steve, who's a GP, and they have 3 children and 4 grandchildren who live in the UK and in New Zealand. She enjoys tennis, swimming, coffee, travel, and watching the Silver Ferns, the White Ferns, and the All Blacks, which is like lots of colours. So, Cathy, thank you so much for coming. We look forward to these 6 lectures that remind us that another world is possible and invite us on an adventure in which we can see mission as an adventure of the imagination. There will be plenty of time for questions at the end of the lecture, so save them up. For those of you who are watching online, you can either put them in the chat on the Theology Facebook page, or you can comment on the post that is on the Theology Facebook page, and the link is up there on the screen for you. So, Cathy, thank you for coming. We welcome you here with us today. Kia ora.
Kia ora tātou, ko Katarina Ahau, ko Tipene tāku tānei, ko Akarana tāku kāinga, ko ngā toru tamariki a whāt mokopuna, ko rangitoto tāku maonga, ko waitamata tāku moana. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. It's good to be with you. Nice to be able to speak a little bit of Māori. And thank you very much for inviting me to give this series of lectures. So, as Lynn said, 6 lectures around the theme of another world is possible. So tonight we're going to be looking at Lament, and then tomorrow on hospitality, and then thinking about salvation. What is salvation? And then next week we'll be looking at whiteness and racial justice, empire, and then finishing with a kind of summing up his mission as an adventure of the imagination. It's really good to be at the University of Otago, and I discovered just last week that the academic administrator on our team at CMS is related to Robbie Burns. So that was interesting. I thought, oh, that'll give me some street cred. Better say that. So let's get started. So another world is possible, lament and hope. There are things that can be seen only with eyes that have cried. So I wonder if this is a familiar sentiment for some of us, particularly for us Kiwis, whether at home or overseas. In recent months, with the cyclone and the rain and all the climate disasters, the pandemic, as well as the terrorist attack on the mosque in Christchurch a few years ago. And for us, from afar, we have felt the pain and anxiety for loved ones and for the land itself. And I know that for those of you who live here, this must be much more immediate, intense, and perhaps even visceral. It's tough to see the people you love and the land you love suffering such devastation and disaster. And all of this after the COVID pandemic, various lockdowns, ongoing mental health issues, the war in Ukraine, economic fallout, what's going on in Sudan at the moment, climate disasters, and also for us, those of you who live here, and even for expatriate Kiwis, exploring our own colonial history and wondering just what just co-governance might look like. So how then do we face our current and global context, and where do we find hope? So I think it's important to remember that others have been there before us and have experienced various kinds of trauma as well, and others before us have found hope. North American writer and chronicler Rebecca Solnit writes powerfully about hope. When she wrote about the Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, she found grounds for hope in the altruism that she saw at work in the world, as well as in our response to disaster. She believes that authorities think that our response to disaster will be to behave badly, and that our brutish nature will emerge. However, she observed that in most disasters, the majority of people are calm, resourceful, altruistic, and creative. Incidentally, this is also a thesis put forward by a young Dutch journalist, Rutger Bregman, in his recent book, Humankind, A Hopeful History, where he believes that we are better than we think we are, and he explores various scenarios to illustrate this. I just read this recently. It's an interesting take for the son of a Dutch Reformed pastor. So Solnit believes that a disaster can open up another possible world. And she writes thus: a disaster is a lot like a revolution when it comes to disruption and improvisation, to new roles in an unnerving or exhilarating sense that now anything is possible. So as I read these words, it made me wonder, can we then dare to hope? Indian novelist Arundhati Roy, writing about the pandemic, considers it as a portal, a gateway between this world and the next. And she urged us not to return to normality, but to reimagine our world anew so that we can walk through lightly, with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. So like Solnit, she sees hope in the possibilities for newness and change, but that this will not come about automatically. We must be prepared to struggle for it. So I wonder how we feel about that a couple of years later, as we're, in theory, post-pandemic times. Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann picks up a similar theme by recalling the importance of memory. He says memory produces hope in the same way that amnesia produces despair. He reminds us that our hope is grounded in memory and that our consumer culture is actually organised against history. He says there's a depreciation of memory and a ridicule of hope, which means everything must be held in the now, either an urgent now or an eternal now. Being immersed in our present consumer culture then deadens any expectations that we can reshape the future. Solnit explains that our memories can give us hope for the new, as we remember the good things that we fought to change in the past, to bring about the new, such as the end of slavery, universal suffrage, a living wage. Brueggemann advocates the idea of change by the use of the term disruptive. So he explains, he says, I think we think in terms of systems and continuities and predictability and schemes and plans. I think the Bible is to some great extent focused on God's capacity to break those schemes open and to violate those formulae. When they're positive disruptions, the Bible calls them miracles, we tend not to use that word when they are negative. But what it means is that the reality of our life and the reality of God are not contained in most of our explanatory schemes. And to understand this, he draws on the biblical language of lament to help us to name and face these crises or negative disruptions and then to find hope. As we name and face our situation, mourn and grieve the current realities, sit with them and not rush on, then we can begin tentatively to find hope. Another scholar that has written powerfully on the themes of lament and hope is Ugandan Roman Catholic scholar Emmanuel Katangole, in his book, Born from Lament, The Theology and Politics of Hope in Africa. This is a book that looks squarely at the truly terrible, evil, cruel violence and tragic suffering in Congo. And he reflects on how and why this has happened. He details the trauma and the depth of loss experienced, the loss of community, the loss of humanity, and more tragically, the loss of future. So I'm sure you know some of the horror and suffering, children taken from their villages and told to kill their relatives. He cites a 2011 study that indicated that 1,152 women were raped every day during that conflict, a rate of 48 per hour. And American study shows that 12% of all Congolese women have been raped at least once. I won't elaborate further, the stories are truly chilling. And so Katangole asks, how does one live with this? Can there be a future, and if so, what kind? And where is God? And like Brueggemann, he finds the clue to the future in the power and hope of lament. Katangole believes that in the face of such pain and trauma, the church in Africa and everywhere needs to learn how to lament. He suggests that the African church tends to focus on a powerful God, a God who performs miracles, who is mighty to save and who reigns supreme, all of which is true, of course, but that we also need to know how to lament in the face of suffering, trauma, and pain. The counterpoint to our Almighty God is the crucified God, seen in Jesus Christ on the cross, who continues to suffer with and among us. So, with Katangole's insights and an example from Burundi, I would like to consider lament in the following ways, which I've grouped as lament as articulation and complaint, lament as resistance, justice and innovation, and lament as newness and hope. Firstly, some context. Katangole reminds us that for Israel, their safety and security are not found in military might and strength, nor in wealth or cybersecurity, but in their covenant relationship with Yahweh. Yes, the Israelites praised God, but they also protested at God. They railed against injustice. They pressed God for deliverance. We see this especially in the Psalms. Of the 150 Psalms, 60 of them, or about 40%, are known as Psalms of Lament. There are Psalms of Praise, Psalms of Thanksgiving, the Royal Psalms, but the largest category are the Psalms of Lament. This meant that the core of Israel's life, social, religious, and community, was framed by lament. There's a generally recognised structure to these Psalms of Lament with 5 elements. So let's take Psalm 13 as an example. How long, O Lord? So there's the address or articulation directed to God. And then the complaint, which describes the problem. Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I bear pain in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all day long? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? And then the request, which asks for a specific response from God. Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep the sleep of death. The motivation that articulates the reason God should help. And my enemy will say, I have prevailed. My foes will rejoice because I am shaken. But I trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. Finishing with confidence, I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. So these elements of articulation, complaint, request, motivation, and confidence do vary, as they're not found in all Psalms of Lament, but they do signify a kind of turning to God, which reflects, I think, a deep intimacy with God. A relationship of trust, intimacy, and love is a necessary precondition for genuine lament. When the biblical writers lament, they do so from within the context of a foundational relationship that binds together the individual with members of the community of faith and that community with their God. And Katangole reminds us that biblical lament is neither a kind of unrestrained whining at God, nor a kind of angry venting, but rather it's a structured and complex language of complaint, protest, and appeal directed to God. So this makes it a distinct faith language with its own vocabulary and grammar for those intimate and difficult conversations with God when we're hurting. And another important facet we notice is that lament often moves into praise. The laments and songs of thanksgiving belong together in Israel's worship. They have the confidence to express the entire range of human emotions before God: doubt, faith, sorrow, joy, fear, trust, life, death. Such is the confidence born out of the covenant relationship and a sign of the depth of their relationship with their loving God. After all, what kind of relationship is it if we can only express our joy and faith, but not our need, our sorrow, our pain, our trauma, our complaints even? So lament as articulation and complaint. The first cry in Psalm 13 is, "How long, O Lord?" And we find a similar sentiment in the book of Lamentations. There the first word is ikar. These are protestations of lament. Ikar is a cry of mourning, a kind of primordial and primeval cry to give voice to deep suffering. This ancient cry embodies a whole range of emotions: grief, despair, anguish, forgiveness, shame, hope, compassion. It's also a cathartic expression. How can God treat them like this? And in a context of suffering, a cry of lament is important, physiologically, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. The cries not only express our pain, but also encourage us to sit with it. We cannot rush away from this. This is a painful and present reality. We have to remain with it in all its dread and difficulty. Complaint is a key component of lament. Expressions of complaint in the Psalms range from expressions of concern to utter desperation in the face of illness before one's enemies, or protestations of innocence. However, to complain is risky and perhaps seems almost improper. But I think it also shows that the relationship with God is alive, dynamic, and open. It also refuses to accept things the way they are. It protests God's silence and presses God for deliverance. This requires courage to protest in this way against God, but we see it again and again in the Psalms and in the prophets such as Jeremiah. And it may also be a way forward into newness. In the Psalms of Lament, while the writers draw on memories of God's saving actions in the past, there was always the risk and possibility that God will act in totally new ways as a result of this present suffering. So we may see and learn something totally new and unexpected about God. This suggests that Israel understood complaint as an essential part of their covenant relationship with God. Katangole believes that it is not those who lack faith who complain, but those recognised for strong faith who bring their most honest and passionate feelings to God. It ensures that the relationship is alive, dynamic, negotiated, contested. Voicing lament and pain can be a form of resistance and a path to healing. It means that we will not be rendered powerless and voiceless. We will not remain paralysed by despair. And it's also risky because complaint is a form of protest. It refuses to accept things the way they are. It presses God for deliverance. It challenges God. How long, O God? Why do you hide your face? The psalmists say some outrageous things, such as, you are the one who has done this. Remove your scourge from me. I'm overcome by the blow of your hand. It challenges God's silence. It puts God on the spot. And what kind of God remains silent to his people's pleas? However, perhaps God's silence also allows space for human speech, touch, and human healing. Old Testament scholar Kathleen O'Connor, writing on the Book of Lamentations, notes, God's silence in Lamentations leaves wounds festering, open to the air, and possible to healing. The benefit of exposed wounds is that they become visible and unavoidable. Left exposed, they require us to see, acknowledge, and attend to them. Might the silence of God also point to a fresh dimension of God? Might this suggest a mysterious God, an ineffable God, a vulnerable God who grieves alongside us in the face of such suffering? Perhaps these cries of lament reflect God's own lamentations, the God who suffers with us. Jesus' incarnation and his cry of dereliction on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" testify to this reality. O'Connor also believes that the silence of God is inspired and that its haunting power lies in its brutal honesty. God's frightening silence is resonant with interpretive possibility. It makes the poetry a haven for voices of pain. It prevents us from sliding prematurely over suffering towards happy endings. African American gospel songs, the slave spirituals, are a powerful expression of their belief that God was with them in their suffering, even while they were living in their whirling vortex of God-forsakenness. The slave songs are drenched in pain and sadness, but they also express a spirit of resistance, confidence, and hope. What gave them their confidence was the Exodus story, that ultimately God would save or rescue them, and also their identification of their own suffering with that of Christ's forsakenness on the cross. I'm told that during the apartheid years in South Africa, the most popular services were the Good Friday services because the people could identify with Jesus in his pain, suffering, and desolation. Jesus understood the slaves, the oppressed, the anguish of apartheid, because he too knew misery, anguish, and forsakenness. And this resonance gave them the ability to endure and to hope. And ultimately, it was those spirituals that gave birth to the freedom songs of the American Civil Rights Movement. Martin Luther King Jr. commented, "The freedom songs are playing a strong and vital role in our struggle. They give the people new courage and a sense of unity, I think they keep alive a faith, a radiant hope in the future, particularly in our most trying hours. So what about us? How do we engage with lament? Brueggemann and others have highlighted the absence of lament in our churches. Brueggemann connects it with an inability to face suffering and to embrace negativity in our Western world. And North American theologian Glenn Pemberton suggests that the church, as a middle-class institution, has become increasingly embarrassed by the earthy and gritty language of lament. He writes, "We have chosen to live protected lives in insulated communities, whether our community is a middle to upper class neighbourhood or a church with a fortress mentality. Our lack of solidarity with those in need is what causes us to wonder why these prayers are in the Bible and to question who would ever need them. Perhaps this is because of our increased prosperity and identification with the mainstream. Lament sounds dreary and negative to those who do not wish to be reminded either of their own vulnerability and suffering or that of those around them." North American biblical scholar Ellen Davis offers us some hard-hitting and challenging insights. She suggests that when we read Psalm 109, we need to turn it 180 degrees so that it's directed towards us, and to ask ourselves, is there anyone in the community of God's people who might want to say this to God about me or about us? We are active participants in a rapacious industrial economy, regularly consuming far more than we need of the world's goods. And she then projects this idea onto our great-grandchildren's generation, to say nothing of the present majority world, who might cry out and lament to God. Let their memory be cut off from the earth, because they did not remember to act in covenant faith, but hounded a person poor and needy, crushed in heart, even to death. And Brueggemann concludes, a community of faith which negates lament soon concludes that the hard issues of justice are improper questions to pose at the throne, because the throne seems only to be a place of praise. I believe it thus follows that if justice questions are improper questions at the throne, they soon appear to be improper questions in public places, in schools and hospitals, with the government, and eventually even in the courts. Justice questions disappear into civility and docility. A loss of lament can then signify a loss of passion for social justice. So to sum up, lament is a kind of discipline that involves multiple actions: crying out, remembering, keeping silent, repenting, and praying. The public practice of lament is essentially having the courage to name what is happening, to insist on engaging with God in the midst of the tragedy and suffering. It is a way of keeping hope alive amidst the despair, as well as a way of reminding those of us in relative comfort to remember the vital importance of lament to bring about justice and change. So moving on to my second section, lament as resistance, justice, and innovation. Lament can be a form of resistance and can ultimately bring about justice, newness, and hope. We've already noted that the African American slave spirituals are a form of resistance, and lament is also a form of agency. A cry of anguish is not only a way of naming and mourning what is lost, but also it's a way of standing in the midst of the suffering. And so lament deepens our engagement with the world of suffering and invites us into more active social and political engagement. So let me offer you a dramatic example of this by telling you about Maggie Barangkitse, and we'll watch a short video clip in a moment about her story, but just as an introduction, Maggie is a Tutsi. She was caught up in the ethnic massacres in Burundi, not Rwanda, but in Burundi in 1993. In October 1993, she hid in the local bishop's residence as soldiers attacked, stripped Maggie and tied her to a chair and then massacred 72 people, including one of her best friends. Amazingly, her 7 children all survived the massacre by hiding in the sacristy. Karingole narrates her story. After the massacre, Maggie crawled into the chapel. She prayed as she cried. My mother taught me you were a God of love. She lied to me. You are not love. God, why was I not killed? Why am I here? Why, O God? As she prayed and cried, she heard Chloe. The children had escaped by hiding, and bribing the militia with money, she managed to save another 25 children from the burning building. And as night fell, she sought refuge at the house of a German development worker. Maggie went on to set up Maison Shalom, houses for children, farms, businesses, a swimming pool, a cinema, a hospital, a nursing school, a microcredit finance union, and even a university. So we're just going to watch a short clip now of Maggie's story.
She calls it Maison Shalom. It's here in the Burundian village of Ruwigi that Maggie Barankitsi has transformed the lives of 30,000 orphans. Maggie has rejected Burundi's past of ethnic hatred, poverty, and genocide. Instead, she's writing a new story. She's created a place where children can be raised in a vision of love and God's abundance. Maison Shalom now includes a farm, hospital, movie theater, swimming pool, and mechanics shop, among other businesses.
We Christian, our duty, it's not to go every day in the church and praying, and then it's to give back the dignity to the human person, because all the project is surrounding this human person. Yes, we can give clothes, we can feed the person, but if he has no dignity, it's not.
It began at the start of Burundi's civil war. Maggie, an ethnic Tutsi, was working as a secretary at the Catholic bishop's house in Ruwigi. She had adopted 7 children, 4 Hutus and 3 Tutsis. In October 1993, Tutsi assailants attacked the compound. Maggie was stripped naked and tied up. 72 Hutus were killed before her eyes, including priests and nuns. One was her best friend, Juliet.
My friend Juliet looked at me and said, please, educate my children, Lydia and Lisette, like your own children. Give them the love, but I prefer to die with my husband. And then they cut the head and they give me.
Maggie's 7 adopted children survived, and she managed to save another 25 children as well. But she didn't stop there. This horrific experience was the start of Maggie's calling, not just to save children, but to proclaim the gospel message of love by raising a new generation without the hatred and bitterness she already saw growing in their eyes.
Every day, I improvise new life because love makes us inventor.
Emmanuel Kotongole is a Catholic priest and professor at Duke Divinity School. He's the author of The Sacrifice of Africa, a book about Christian leaders in Africa, including Maggie.
Maggie says, love has made me an inventor. But in order to understand what she says and what she means by love has made me an inventor, you need to go back a little and discover that for Maggie, love is our true identity. She is, in a way, entering into that story of love and kind of allowing that story to, if you like, explode from within in order to show what it means. That's what she says. Love has made me an inventor. Kind of living within that story of love in a way allows me to invent a new future. So being an inventor is about inventing a new future of being God's beloved.
But Maggie's calling was to do more than just protect children. 18 years after that terrible day, Maison Shalom is thriving. With Maggie as the visionary catalyst, Maison Shalom is building an enduring and sustainable institution. Maison Shalom challenges the notion that Burundi is a poor country. It challenges the idea that Burundi's 600,000 orphans cannot thrive, that hatred and ethnic divisions must continue.
It's so stupid to hate the others because they are different than us, because it's harmony. To see Hutu and Tutsi together, Congolese, other white person, God wants to make, it's so beautiful to see those differences become richness.
Maggie insists that the people of Burundi can live full, rich lives. This includes entertainment, such as watching movies and swimming.
When they ask me, you want to make a cinema in Ruigi where is a war and they will destroy everything? And why a cinema and a swimming pool? And I said, why you must always give us clothes and so we can dream like you.
Maison Shalom now comprises many businesses, including a mechanics school, a tailor's shop, and a hair salon.
You see, to dream also, not only to, you can sit and they will cut your hair.
All are part of the vision. The enterprises generate income and make Maison Shalom sustainable, but they also carry a powerful theological message. The swimming pool isn't just a place for the children to have fun. It's a symbol of the waters of baptism built on a killing field.
And then where I have found many bodies, because I am Christian, I said I will put a swimming pool in, because of the water of our baptized, clean all the sin.
Maison Shalom also includes a morgue. In a nation where killing has become routine, families now have a place to honor their dead.
For this dignity, I must give opportunity to the family to cry.
There's an area for celebrating and feasting. In the midst of so much death, this space speaks to the hope of resurrection.
We never die, really, because we go, our mission on here is finished. We continue another because we are created for eternity.
Maggie is sharing her vision beyond Ruigi and even Burundi. Maison Shalom is a demonstration plot of hope. Her work has been recognized with the Opus Prize, a faith-based humanitarian award for social innovation.
Maggie wants to foment, if you like, a revolution. She calls it a revolution of love. And so it's quite ambitious. She wants a revolution, not only in Ruigi, in Burundi, beyond Burundi, to the whole world, a revolution of love.
My dream is to build all over the world Shalom House, to say we are only one family. And it's my dream, like John Lennon and his song, Imagine. This is life.
Under Maggie's leadership, Maison Shalom has become a place of hope, joy, and a new community.
So there are some important things to note about Maggie in the context of Lament. After the massacre, she experienced an incredible energy, determination, and anger, all of which she turned to setting up Maison Shalom. But the key driver for her was love. She operates out of an excess of love, which was a basic theological principle for her. She said, "Love made me an inventor." I love that phrase, "Love made me an inventor." It was love that caused her to innovate. So in the face of all this trauma, she improvised and innovated so the children could survive, but not only survive, flourish. She invented a new community, not only Tutsi or Hutu, but a community beyond tribalism. She came up with very practical ideas, as you saw, the workshops, the salon, the cinema, the hospital, and even a swimming pool. Her love was deepened through her grief and lament. There is something about pain and suffering at the heart of love. There are things that can be seen only with eyes that have cried, said Archbishop Christopher Muzihira, the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Bukavu. In the midst of the civil war in Eastern Congo, he worked for peace, to build structures of justice, forgiveness, and love. He experienced the war, the ethnic violence, the refugee crisis, the destruction of Bukavu. He was a prophet for a new vision of society, but after 2 years as Archbishop, he was assassinated. He was shot dead at a checkpoint. There are things that can be seen only with eyes that have cried. Out of the pain and intense suffering and anger, Maggie found the courage to take risks and to innovate. She was determined that death and evil would never have the last word because she innovated something new, which offered newness and hope, and because love wins. And it's vital to remember that love wins, because I have a sad PS about Maggie's story. So in 2015, the president of Burundi, President Pierre Nkurunziza, decided to run for a third term. This plunged the economy and the whole country into crisis. Thousands fled, hundreds were arrested, many were killed. Maggie spoke out against the third term. She was targeted and she fled into exile, where she still is living and working in Rwanda. The government shut down all the Maison Shalom programs in Burundi, including the schools, the hospital in Ruigi. They closed the bank accounts, they confiscated the assets, and they even killed some of the children. These events have obviously deepened Maggie's lament. This is not a happy ending. This is not a happily ever after story. And yet somehow that makes Maggie's story even more real and more poignant. We do what we can with the resources we have through the inspiration of God's Spirit, and we leave the rest to God. But her story is not over. She fled to Rwanda, where she now lives in exile, and she started all over again and has established Maison Shalom there, a vocational training centre for Burundian refugees in Rwanda. And Kadangoli draws some intriguing lessons from Maggie's story, which may even be pertinent for us here in Aotearoa in a post-disaster context with all the recent climate disasters. We've already noticed that she was driven by love and compassion. She claims that love is our true identity, that love is the most beautiful calling of human beings. We are created out of love and to love, she says. And Katangole asserts that her efforts to invent a new community beyond tribalism are a form of madness, and that to be a Christian is to be invited into a drama of madness. Indeed, Maggie herself reminds us that the first crazy man was Jesus, and she challenges us to be crazy for love. In Burundi, the majority of children that Maggie has welcomed into Maison Shalom are orphans, street children, and former child soldiers. And this reflects a profound theological belief that God's love is for all, but especially for the poor, the vulnerable, and the weak. Katangole affirms, if God's love invents a new social reality in history, that reality begins not in the centres of power, but at the margins of society, with overlooked and wounded individuals and communities. In situations of suffering and disaster, it's usually the poorer and more vulnerable communities that suffer the most. What kind of inventiveness or innovation might love drive us towards? What might that mean for Aotearoa New Zealand as the country faces issues of climate change and where to rebuild after the recent climate disasters? Or what might that mean as we investigate our own colonial history and work towards forms of just co-governance? Maggie's grief over her situation turned her into an inventor, which she expressed through resistance, love, and innovation. We may experience similar feelings and reactions when we think about the future of our planet. In a recent book on eco-anxiety, Anglican priest Reverend Frances Ward writes about the deep foreboding she experiences about the future of our planet. And Reverend Liz Hoare, spirituality lecturer at Wycliffe Hall in Oxford, writes, "I am crying as I write this because I am sad, so very sad, at the loss of beauty and variety in this world." We are experiencing climate grief, eco-anxiety, solastalgia, which means homesickness in a dying world, or what Finnish theologian Panu Pikala names as difficult feelings because of the ecological crisis. There's a small but growing body of work that is beginning to name this deep lament and fear that we experience as we grieve for our planet. Young English theologian Hannah Malcolm won the 2019 Theology Slam Prize in England with her lecture entitled Climate Chaos and Collective Grief. She explores some of the complexities of this, from the temptations to romanticize Mother Nature, to flatten the differences between humans and other creatures, or to demonize all human activity. However, she reminds us that we grieve the death of particular things. Or, to put it another way, if grief is an expression of love, our grief takes on the shape of the places and creatures to whom we intimately belong. Her book is a series of stories of grief and lament from different contexts around the world, describing the beloved things we have lost. So naming the grief and taking time to lament can then lead us to hope, innovation and action, as it did for Maggie. Ward writes, "To reach that fierce hope, I need to lament, to allow that ancient practice to find expression and turn the debilitating fear and anxiety outwards into action." We do need resources to fuel this and to be able to live without despair. We can find hope in taking action and in reimagining how to live on our planet. Over 50 years ago, the Church Mission Society General Secretary and later Bishop of Winchester, John Taylor, wrote about a theology of enough. This is 50 years ago. He believed that the concept of enough is a theme woven throughout the scriptures. For example, the laws of first fruits and limited cropping, or the idea of Jubilee. More recently, University of Oxford economist Kate Raworth brilliantly reimagined economics for the 21st century with her theory of donut economics, which aims to ensure that no one is left without and that has an ecological ceiling so that the planet is not overexploited. She claims that we must reject economies that concentrate resources in the hands of fewer and fewer people, and that we should design a kind of distributive economics. And she's designed a model in which the goal is human thriving, as well as safeguarding the planet's life systems and providing for all people's needs. In her approach, everyone could live above the poverty line, partly because we would reject greed and excess and be content with enough. Now, I'm not an economist, but I found this intriguing, and I think this is the kind of innovative thinking that is needed for the survival of all creation. And then finally, lament as newness and hope. As with Maggie, lament can lead to hope and innovation. Malcolm writes, "To lament, we must name the damage, express grief, act out restitution, and so access restoring forgiveness. Hope, like lament, becomes a way of being in the world." Eco-psychologist Michael Apathy asserts that in order to deal with the climate crisis effectively, we need to do our own inner spiritual and psychological work, as well as the outer work of activism and making real systemic changes in our world. Like Maggie, we need to innovate for climate justice and change. It's important to connect with others and community to do this together and to draw on organisations like Arosha or Extinction Rebellion, Climate Justice Aotearoa, Forest and Bird to help us bring about change and to find hope. Former Archbishop Rowan Williams writes powerfully on hope. He writes, "Hope is a condition here and now, not a foretelling of what lies ahead, and certainly not an inoculation against loss, but the affirmation that God is bound to the finite reality that God loves, and it's God's business to honour that binding. Meanwhile, we keep ourselves open to the God who acts and speaks in the present, and we labour at whatever we can do to prevent catastrophe, even if we are fearful that all our effort is too late. We still celebrate the swallow in the moment. Anticipating loss can be a way of slipping away from a gift that is here and now. Without the celebration now, the loss would actually be softened in a strange way. The risk of loss gives the joy a kind of fierceness. We have already noted that lament can have a surprising turn to praise. However, lament and praise are not simply juxtaposed. Rather, there can be an unexpected movement which brings about a fresh perspective and new language. So this possibility of lament turning into praise reflects a transformation and innovation, a novelty that is only possible with the articulation of both pain and belief. Biblical lament has the potential to bring us to a new place, to a new depth, to a new song of praise, which is qualitatively different from the praise that has gone before. It is a new kind of depth of knowledge and experience only made possible by the experience of the suffering, the pain, and lament. It's a new kind of seeing, a kind of seeing emerging from the pain, suffering, and anguish. There are things that can be seen only with eyes that have cried. This is an important insight, that there is newness and hope after the pain, but it will be different, and we will arrive there only because of the pain. Perhaps Pope Francis's metaphor of the church as field hospital might be appropriate here, repairing the brokenness and healing the wounds. Not that we are the sole actors in this regard, but we could offer a theological grammar of hope. By standing alongside those who are suffering, by being with, rather than doing for or to, we participate in the mystery of God's own suffering, death, and resurrection. It is this participation that mysteriously releases hope. And Kadangole claims that the African church is in fact a unique gift to world Christianity as a laboratory of hope, which provides a living witness of what hope looks like in the context of violence and war. Are we able, in our own context, to be a field hospital or perhaps a field nursery or garden that heals and binds the wounds, stands in solidarity with the afflicted and traumatized, challenges injustice, and innovates to offer hope and to bring about newness? So let me just conclude now with a poem by Denise Levertov entitled Beginners. But we have only begun to love the earth. We have only begun to imagine the fullness of life. How could we tire of hope? So much is in bud. How can desire fail? We have only begun to imagine justice and mercy, only begun to envision how it might be to live as siblings with beast and flower, not as oppressors. Surely our river cannot already be hastening into the sea of non-being. Surely it cannot drag in the silt all that is innocent. Not yet, not yet. There is too much broken that must be mended, too much hurt that we have done to each other that cannot yet be forgiven. We have only begun to know the power that is in us if we would join our solitudes in the communion of struggle. So much is unfolding that must complete its gesture. So much is in bud. Thank you.